welcome as we come on in today to share a conversation together. So, I want to welcome you and everyone to the Model Resolutions conversation centering the net zero model resolutions, building from the commitment of the agencies and the support of the Council of Bishops towards a net zero church, and looking at how that might work in the annual conferences. But first of all, I want to introduce you to Kathy Velasquez Eberhardt. Kathy Velasquez Eberhardt is one of the key founders of the United Methodist Creation Justice Movement and a United Methodist Earthkeeper, and just wonderful, dedicated to this work. And so, Kathy, you want to come on and share with us about the movement? That would be wonderful.
Sounds good. Thanks so much, all of you, for joining tonight, and all of you who are watching this video after it's been recorded. This is, I think, one of the more important resolutions of all. They're all really important, but those of us who are really becoming aware of the climate crisis are hearing and talking a lot more about net zero. And so I'm excited for us to get into that conversation. But what I've been invited to do today is just introduce you to the group that is kind of sponsoring this. The United Methodist Creation Justice Movement is really a new effort of existing efforts, an opportunity to connect the many parts of the church that have been working and talking and thinking about creation justice over the years. And so as some of us became more and more aware of the urgency, we kept asking, what more might we do together as people of faith, as a church, as a denomination? And so out of that grew this, what we're calling the Creation Justice Movement of the United Methodist Church, that's connecting folks at the individual level as Earth Keepers, United Methodist, United Women in Faith, and as local churches, annual conferences, all of our boards and agencies, all of the different parts that make up this thing that we call the United Methodist Church. All of those are resources and opportunities for us to take action together. And so that's really what the United Methodist Creation Justice Movement is intended to do. Out of that, we've created a number of work teams. We have a team that's working on worship, another working on advocacy for both federal and state level advocacy. We have a communications team that's developed a wide variety of communication channels to keep us connected and informed and help us hear what everyone else is doing. And then we have this team, annual conference organizing team, which is really what this workshop and the work of these model resolutions has emerged out of that team. Now, that team has worked to encourage conversations with our bishops about creation justice and the climate crisis. We've offered opportunities to network as jurisdictional teams. We've shared ideas for promoting this work and building teams in our annual conferences. And in the past, we had a chance to gather resolutions that have been created in the past and had been passed in the past. And now, this past year, a very dedicated group worked really hard the last few months to draft some model legislation, model resolutions, really, for annual conferences to consider promoting in the coming year, annual conference, either this year or in the future. And so we this really follows on one of the ways that the Creation Justice Movement emerged was by trying to take a look at all of those beautiful words that the United Methodist Church has. And these resolutions are additional commitments to those words. And we know that even if we pass them all, there's still work to do to implement them. But we know that this is important work to have these conversations in our churches and in our annual conferences. Now, the last thing I'll close with, you'll hear a lot about net zero, but we know that from the latest IPCC reports that we can't afford to just talk about this problem of the climate crisis. We really actually need to lower greenhouse gases. And so these efforts to get to net zero, to lower our carbon footprint, are really essential if we're going to take climate change seriously. And as our denomination, we're really understanding that there's a lot of power held in our annual conferences and in our local churches. The bishops do have power in terms of stating goals for the church. Our boards and agencies also have a great deal of influence and power. But it's in our annual conferences and in our churches where we have to do this important work of figuring out how to lower our carbon footprint as a denomination. And that really falls to all of us. So I look forward to this conversation. I hope this webinar inspires you to take courage and to really dig into this work. As Rishinda mentioned, this is being recorded. We encourage you to share it. And if you missed the one that we held on Monday about some of the others, we'll be sharing that link as well. And so just grateful for you all to be here and to participate in this conversation. I'll turn it back to you, Rishinda.
Thank you, Kathy. So yes, that's like one of my favorite things about the United Methodist Creation Justice Movement is that we do this work together, that we have created these virtual and in-person circles and conversations that our hearts move us in this direction of climate and creation care, recognizing the urgency and also knowing that we want to get there together. And so the energy of the movement is rising, and I am so very glad. I hope you see this as a safe space and we can be kind and respectful to each other in this space. This is definitely one of the hallmarks of the movement, is that kindness and that respect together. And I'm going to introduce the people that we're going to hear from today. So we've heard from the wonderful Kathy, also offering some conversation and insight around, especially around one of the model resolutions, which he wrote, is Bob Downs. He's a retired engineer and biophysicist and a general board of Global Ministries Earthkeeper. He attends Christ United Methodist Church in Kettering, Ohio, and he is also the chair of the Creation Force Task Force in the West Ohio Annual Conference. So he's going to be sharing about the resolution he wrote today. Also with us is Elizabeth Chunhyoi Lee, Liz Lee, who serves as United Women in Faith's Director of Mobilization and Advocacy. So she most recently served as the Executive for Economic and Environmental Justice and Climate Justice. She was that lead. Her primary area of work is around advancing climate justice with United Women in Faith members, church, society, through trainings, program development, partnerships, corporate engagement, advocacy, and solidarity. So you can see why we're so glad that Liz Lee is here with us today. Her heart of advocacy and her insight and her long time working at the intersection of human rights, creation justice, and faith. Also with us is Reverend Nancy Blade. She is a United Methodist elder serving in rural and small town churches in Northern Illinois since 1988. Early in her career, she was in the Northern Illinois Conference. She was the representative to the North Central Jurisdiction, Town and Country Association, and chairperson of the Church's Center for Land and People. In 2015, she joined a new task force focusing on eco-sustainability and became the co-chair of the group in 2017. And as part of her efforts includes things like resolutions, and she has also paid attention to this idea of what is a net zero by 2050. And she will talk to us about how she is seeing that fit in her annual conference. So welcome to everybody who is here to share today, and I am so glad you're here. Just to give a nutshell of our conversation, so the denominational boards and agencies resolved in 2021 to move forward to a net zero in 2050. And the effort was affirmed by the Council of Bishops, suggesting the effort be brought forward to the annual conferences. So these resolutions today are an effort to support that process of bringing this net zero dream into a reality within our annual conferences. So that's really kind of where we are and what we hope to do today. With that, I want to turn it over to Liz Lee, and go ahead, Liz, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you. So It's so great to be in this space. My name is Elizabeth Chan Lee, as the Reverend Richinda said, and it's so, I have been with the UM Creation Justice Movement since the time we began it. And so United Women in Faith, then United Methodist Women, we were together collectively in some spaces, like how can we be a movement of movements and of United Methodists committed to caring for God's creation? And I'm so thrilled to be back in this space. I feel like I'm amongst friends and family, deeply committed to co-creation and justice. So thank you for the work that you're doing. And for those who are listening to the recording, even afterward, we do this work together. And I do want to share a bit about what that means very practically at the agency level and how it came about together. So many of you may or may not be familiar. We have that within the United Methodist Church, we have many agencies with different responsibilities and charges. And some may think, well, emissions reductions, well, surely it should be, purely with WestPath around investor engagement, right? Or it should be with GCFNA around this way, or it should be with pensions, or it should be with church and society to do advocacy, right? So we could think about it in lots of different ways, but holistically, if we're wanting to really address net zero, it requires all of us. And saying very practically, many of us agencies have operations, programming, planning, and emit regularly and consistently through our employees, through our travels, et cetera. And what can we do as our contribution to address the climate crisis? Kathy had noted the IPCC report came out, 1.1 degrees Celsius already. What are we going to do? And we know we need drastic systemic change at the policy level and implementation, and as faith communities and as the United Methodist Church, we need to do more as well. So that's kind of the premise. And so I'm going to share my screen. And this first screen in particular, you'll see that we actually frame it as the United Methodist Just and Equitable Net Zero Coalition that came together. And this is pretty intentional because it's not only about net zero, just addressing the climate crisis by reducing emissions, but saying that we have a responsibility as people of faith integrating the various components. And so I did want to note what the implications are. And so you heard about this statement in 2021. A number of agencies, and now 12, signed on to this statement. And as it states, we, the undersigned, pledge to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 across ministries, facilities, operations, and investments, and to leverage the gifts of our connection, putting equity and justice at the center as we build a net zero emissions economy by 2050. So there's a lot there, isn't it? And you see that there's a goal of 2050, net zero emissions, and in ministries, facilities, operations, and investments, and that process of putting equity and justice at the center. Within that statement and commitment, it also notes we will build both. And what you will see also is that within the statement, it has other language, which says we will work both to reduce the principal cause of climate disruption, greenhouse gas emissions, and to support a just and equitable transition that dismantles structural barriers to racial and gender equity and builds resilient, flourishing community. So fundamentally, it's tied, right? Emissions reduction, justice, and equity. And if we look at our social principles, it's inherently tied. We're not working in silos. And I think that's the beauty of this statement as well. Again, what I had noted is the commitment areas: ministries, facilities, operations, investments, equity, and justice. The ministries aligning existing ministries with net zero commitments, facilities eliminating emissions through energy efficiency, renewable energy, and other interventions, operations eliminating emissions related to events, travel, and other activities, investments aligning investment portfolios with net zero commitment, equity and justice, advocating for a just and equitable transition to a net zero economy. And again, this is where if you think about your various annual conferences, there's so many different committees and working groups, and some may say with the resolution, we're going to have the task to be done by one entity, right? But there's actually responsibilities on almost most areas that, whether it's a treasurer's office, right? Or whether it's church and society, or whether it's in the operations and the buildings, there is a lot to engage in that provides spaces for increasing and deepening the work, and to do this in cross-cutting ways. So these were the 11 agencies. There's 12 now. And the purpose, right, we want to encourage collaboration amongst agencies that enable innovation and climate change, facilitate sharing best practices and learnings on how to support a just transition to net zero, and leverage the gifts of our connection to support the work. United Methodist in their emissions reduction work. And I just wanted to share some of the processes, because it might be helpful for you in your own at the annual conference level. So we started to look at finalizations of what the commitments are, right? And so having resolutions that Bob will share in terms of what would make sense in your own context, I think is critical. And then doing a lot of work, obviously, to get that passed. And we did a lot of internal work with our respective agencies to get alignment. And then we released it publicly, right? We developed a structure for engagement, and we held a lot of trainings looking at greenhouse gas emissions accounting. What does that mean? And putting together a draft net zero annual report that really allowed for us to put some baselining about where are we at currently, so that we know where we need to move forward in. And that agencies completed the report and explore plans. And I would say we're thinking long-term, right? And that's very helpful, because there were lots of questions of, can we get to net zero in the next 5 years? We have these funding-related issues, or that issues, or these priorities. The churches focused on disaffiliation, crisis, general conference, all these things. And in many ways, having 2050 as a benchmark is very useful, right? Saying that we have a goal, and how are we going to do backwards planning, and accordingly put in resources over the next several years and long term to move us in that direction. So just want to share a picture of the interagency net zero working group when we met, and our first call after it was passed. And the structure of our team has been, there's a larger coalition, there's a core team working on it, and then there's other connectional work areas. So again, this exact structure will not work in your context, but again, thinking about what that looked like for us, we had a core team from Church and Society, Global Ministries, Higher Ed, COM, United Women of Faith, WestPath. And your core team at the annual conference level may include entities that are equivalent at the conference level as well. So again, you don't want this to be siloed in one group, right? How can it be kind of something seized, because all of us are responsible for this work, not just only one entity. And we also wanted to make sure that there's a through line, that the equity and justice issues and considerations are brought in around greenhouse gas emissions accounting in our communications and vice versa. So really this transversal that is taking place. So I hope that helps in terms of what that meant. It has also meant accountability, because we have asked agencies to identify both staff people who will be working on this, and that they would be meeting, and that there is some minimum standards for engagement, and that there would be reports or some accountability internally, right? And that there would be reporting on a regular basis, and also not a place of saying like, here is how you failed, right, to live up to, because some of this relates to funding at the federal level, right? Some of this, there's so many other components that are necessary. So if we want to truly have zero emissions, we need to change the electricity, right? We need to make our electricity, which is just 60-something% based on fossil fuels right now nationally, it needs to go to zero. But to do that, we need to have policies that change. We need our utilities to change. So it's multi-layered. And so working together in a 2050 long-term goal has been helpful. And also saying that there's a role then for church and society, or the work in doing advocacy at the state level, or where the conferences may be doing that at the same time while we're looking at our churches themselves and how to reduce emissions or do energy efficiency, et cetera. So this is an overview of the greenhouse gas protocol, scopes and emissions across the value chain. And we actually did a training on this in looking at scope 1, 2, and 3 and how to do measuring. We also invited someone from EPA to give us guidance in terms of how to do greenhouse gas inventory development process and guidance. And so I note these to say, many of us didn't come with the expertise. We learned together. And I think there's a lot of power in that. So I'll stop there with sharing the screen and want to note that whatever you all are planning, and especially in the resolutions that are written, tying in equity and justice and the advocacy, working with multiple stakeholders in terms of implementation, not having it siloed, because we can truly get the change that we want by using the different entities. And it's not only operations, but also ministries and programs. So there's a lot of advocacy work that needs to be done. And I'll also note in closing that the Inflation Reduction Act has allowed for significant funding. It's not sufficient, but a lot of funding at the state level right now that is being released where churches and many nonprofits and other institutions can tap into for energy efficiency and renewable energy transition as well. So I hope that's helpful. And I know Reverend Jenny Phillips will be coming later to talk to you about more of the details of net zero, I believe. Thank you.
Yes, we are looking forward to seeing Jenny Phillips at our Movement Cafe in, I believe it's June. So, so look for information about that upcoming. Very excited about that. And thank you, Liz, because, bringing these pieces to us, there's all these different pieces. United Methodism has this interlocking, wonderful connectionalism. And so once again, back to that, we don't do this alone. Earlier I was thinking of it as a more personal circle, and here is this like wonderful connectional circle. So thank you for breaking that down for us and sharing that. Appreciate it very much. I want to introduce Bob now. I've kind of introduced him before, but I want to bring him forward, Bob. He has authored the Net Zero Resolution for Annual Conferences, and he's going to share kind of what's in that, why it matters, and turn it over to Bob.
Okay. Rashindo, if you would share the model resolution, which I think most people have seen, but what we were doing, we had developed a number of model resolutions to deal with a number of issues that we thought conferences might be interested in. And we felt that it was necessary to have at least a resolution that deals with the idea of tying conference activities to what's being done in the broader church. As Liz said, in 2021, in the spring, the 11 and then now 12 agencies committed to the net zero greenhouse emissions program. It was endorsed in the fall of that year by the bishops. And the bishops specifically said that, we ought to be looking at this at the local level, at the annual conference level, and in our local churches. So basically, the model resolution starts out with a few references to what the church has already done in terms of trying to look at how we deal with net zero and move toward net zero. And then the resolution itself just says, go ahead, you're going to have to raise it a little bit or people can't read the bottom. There are the whereases. The whereases are fairly straightforward and says essentially we join our bishops and denominational boards and commissions in committing to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Now, how you do that and the mechanisms and what have you are going to depend a lot on the individual conference. The actual language is meant to be adjusted by annual conferences. This was sort of an initial straw man that people could use to look at the issue and then decide to add or subtract as they felt their particular conference and their particular area wanted to deal with this. So what I'm going to show you next is an example of what happened in West Ohio when we went forward with the resolution. Now, before we even submitted it, and one of the things you're going to have to determine is when these need to be submitted. Each conference has a different deadline. Many of them have already passed for this year. So that's something to keep in mind if you're thinking of trying to move forward in 2023. But that doesn't mean you can't move forward with the idea of looking toward 2024. If you're past the point where the resolution could go in, it means that you might be able to do a little more pre-planning and actually start putting together some of the mechanism that you would engage if you brought it forward next year. What we did, now, any member of the United Methodist Church can submit a resolution for consideration by the annual conference. They don't have to be a member, that is a member representing a church at annual conference. An individual, an organization within a church, or boards and agencies and not so much agencies, boards and commissions of the annual conference can put forward resolutions, and they do. What we decided to do in West Ohio, my original intent was to have our Creation Care Task Force put this forward. The problem we had is getting that group together, since they're scattered and what have you. We didn't do it in time for the resolution. So instead, the Green Team from my church put forward our resolution for consideration. Now, we have the endorsement of the Creation Care Task Force, and we expect to get more endorsements between now and June. But what we did here is we made a few minor changes. One was to reflect the idea of justice and equity, which Liz brought up. We changed the way we did the resolution a little bit. We changed, if you go up a little bit on the screen, the second item, the model resolution talked about failure in meeting God's commandment for creation. Members of our team felt that maybe that would be poking people and create reaction that wasn't necessary. So we changed the whereas a little bit into we seek to protect God's creation and improve our environment. So again, a little more of a positive spin on that particular statement. One of the things we also did was when we talked about the bishop's endorsement, we particularly quoted the line that says that they support this, and then they also support action on climate change at the annual conference level. So that we, again, kind of tried to bring in the idea that this is not an off-the-wall idea by a bunch of tree huggers, but actually recommendations of our Council of Bishops, of our agencies, and something where basically we're trying to now get in line and figure out how to do this at the local level that's consistent with what's being done at the national level. Go down just a little bit more. One other thing we did, and this was feedback I got from the conference when we submitted it. It goes in for initial review. I had some feedback that suggested that we say something about, okay, if we make this resolution, what do we do? Not a detailed plan, but just sort of a starting point. And so what we did here, you'll see we said, first of all, join our denominational boards and commissions in committing to a just and equitable reduction of greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050. And then what we did is, to accomplish this, we call on the bishop to set up a working group. We asked for at least 3 or 4 specific organizations to be represented, including finance and administration, Just Mission, which is what we call Church and Society at West Ohio, United Women in Faith, and our Creation Care Task Force. Now, we may want to have others, and the bishop may decide to put others on that team, but at least we wanted that much of a nucleus in terms of moving forward and determining just how the conference would go about doing this and what they have to do in order to plan to reach net zero by 2050. And the other thing we did is we put some responsibility to get going, and we asked for an interim report on where things are and what's happening by 2024. The last thing we did is on the initial resolution, we called on the conference and churches, and we weren't sure exactly how that was going to play out. So what we did is we separated out the church initiative and said individual churches are encouraged to take similar action over the next year. The idea that we're not necessarily dictating to the churches, but rather suggesting that they move forward, just as the bishops suggested that the conferences move forward in looking at this at the local level. I think that gives you a good idea of what we're trying to accomplish. The main thing we're really trying to do is get the annual conferences on board with the agencies and rest of the church in moving toward net zero. 2050 may or may not be the right year, but it's the year that was chosen by the boards and agencies. So it makes sense for us to look at doing that in the annual conferences. I think we're going to come back a little later and talk about some mechanisms and what have you. So I'm not going to go into that at this point, but if that fills the bill, then Rashinda, I turn it back to you.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I love that, talking about how you took this and you kind of shifted it around to make it really fit, and that, of course, being part of the intent of this process. Another person who's here with us, Reverend Nancy Blade, went through a similar process to kind of look at how do we make this work? How are we thinking about making this work? And so I want to turn next to Nancy to walk us through what's going on where she is in Northern Illinois.
Thank you, Rashinda. We all get there from different places, and wherever you start, that's a great place to start. And where we started was building grassroots connections about 8 years ago. We decided we would start with green summits all over the place. So just getting the awareness out. We found that a lot of people they cared about it, but they didn't know what to do. And so we brought together local agencies, Faith in Place and Elevate Energy, North Central College, who's already gone to net zero, agencies that could speak to how to get there and why we need to work on this. And then in 2017, we did have a resolution, and language in resolutions can be harsh, or it can be so soft that nobody does anything. And we used the word encourage. We encouraged our congregations to form green teams, and it didn't seem to get very far. So from 2018, so that's 5 years, we have lost a lot of ground here, and we just still have the names of people, and still we're doing green summits and stuff like that, but we think we kind of lost some energy. And then came the document from the agencies and the Council of Bishops, and that really put energy behind what we wanted to do, and it galvanized our people. So we started with what was already planned, which was a September renewable energy summit. And we kind of pumped that up a little bit. We had Reverend Denny Phillips out from General Board of Global Ministries, and our Westpath person, whose name is Jake Barnett from Westpath. Westpath has put a person on sustainability and have been working through it a lot through the divestment. And Jake is also an earth keeper, and so he and Denny spoke to us and kind of put a little bit more teeth into what we can be doing. And so we had some tours of the church that we were at that had solar panels and geothermal and permeable pavers. And we also had some of our local agencies, Faith in Place and Solar, try to come out. So people were again given another green summit, but we followed that up. We knew we were going to do net zero. So we followed that up with an invitation immediately. My co-chair, Dick Alton, he's a real community organizer. He got everybody's email and sent them an email with a date and a place that we were going to do a net zero strategy planning. And so we met in, we're fortunate enough to have Westpath Investments here located in our annual conference. So we met at Westpath and they gave us lunch again. And we had a community organizer, an organizer facilitator by the name of Barry Williams. And he's been doing this for years, taking concerns of people and getting them to an action plan. So in one day, we went from a dispersed group of 25 people across the annual conference who were saying things like, every time I bring something up, it gets shot down at my church. I don't know where to go from this. I don't know people in other churches. They felt so disconnected. And they took them and then got them we're in 5 groups. We meet monthly and we've all got our little purposes and we're meeting again in April, even though it's only been a couple of months, and we're moving forward with our plan. Now, how that's going to actually fit into the structure is going to be a little difficult. So the first thing we did was we decided we just wanted to get the movement forward, get the words out there, net zero 2050. So we created some buttons, just little pins, and went to the Order of Elders meeting and passed them out. Gave big 3-inch buttons to the bishop and a couple of key people that were already on board with us. And the little buttons went with every person that attended. And we're going to continue doing that at annual conference. But we had these real simple things that cost us $10 to make all these buttons. And the word is getting out there. So, the next thing we're going to do is make some videos. We talked to the bishop about what he thinks we ought to do, which was getting other people on board. As we get through each of our goals, we hope to get the movement to a place that by the end of the year at our church conferences, we can have our church conferences appoint somebody to be in our leadership portal who would be their net zero representative advocate, and also to sign a congregational pledge that they want to help us work toward it. So we're going to try to get all our churches excited about it and working towards it. But as I'm listening to Bob and Liz, I'm realizing how much more of the networking and getting all the people at the table is important. So we're going to work on that too. And as we continue it in Northern Illinois to do that, we're going to use all the people that we can think of, including, we also have a great gift at Garrett Evangelicals, a seminary that we have in our annual conference. And Professor Tim Eberhard is connected with us in various ways. And he's the professor of ecological theology and practice. And he's got students, I think he's got his second class going right now, students from all over the place that are working on that. There's universities that have sustainability graduates now, and we've used them sometimes to tell the story, and it's really fun to do that. Also, we probably need, what I'd like to do is to work more with the youth delegates or the youth members of annual conference and get them excited about this. I haven't met someone under 30 yet that has said that they don't want to be a part of this. They think this is where the church needs to be. Of course, my nephew, who's 16 years old, said, net zero what? What is this about net zero? So I had to explain carbon emissions, but then he got it and he's on board with me too. That's my little bit from Northern Illinois.
Thank you so much, Nancy. That's wonderful. I love the young people are ahead of us, but the lingo is we're still sort of working out how we use shared language together. So that's marvelous. So it's actually my turn to offer. There's another model resolution, and I wrote this one. And of course, we're all team. But if there's blame to be laid, it gets laid on my door. This one is a little more kind of declarative, if you will, and it seeks to kind of encourage us to find some strategic ways to address getting to net zero, including creating a strategic climate budget. So I'm going to share my screen and walk us through what I mean by that and a little bit of that resolution. And again, a thumbs up is helpful to know that folks can see that. Perfect. Okay, so basically, we're on a journey together, a journey to net zero. And in order to get there, we're going to need a strategic climate budget. And this model resolution is for funding for net zero promises. And of course, I'm putting the strategic in there because it's got to be strategic. Can't just throw money at it. We got to do this strategically. And so why? Why is this kind of resolution needed? And that's because we are on a journey to preserve the abundant promises of God for the generations of Abraham. So some of you may have heard of Earth Overshoot Day. There are wonderful data crunchers who have calculated how long it takes for us to go through and use all the resources that can be replenished for 1 year on the Earth, how long it takes us to go through that. And think of it kind of like your pantry, right? You've stocked the pantry for 12 months. You got 12 months of stuff. And boy, wouldn't it be great if some of it was left over to help seed the next year? But let's see how far we get. So how far before globally we use up everything in the pantry? Well, that date is July 27th. Oh, well, oops. Okay. How long before we use up, just as the U.S.? Hopefully the U.S. is doing better than that, right? Not so much. So we come in at March 13th. And there are some countries that don't get on this clock or measurement at all. They are in fact renewing their pantry and having their pantry renewed, but globally we're not, and many countries are not. So in budgetary terms, we start overdrafting the budget on March 14th, and we pile up debt through every season, year after year. Every year we inherit not life, but debt. And this is the worsening legacy that we are leaving to our wonderful children. So how do we address this debt? With a budget, with a plan to assess the situation and develop a strategy for success that vitally includes a strategic climate budget. So what do we do about it? So we identify the problem we are trying to solve, because remember, we're doing strategic work here. We need to address emissions to avert the worst impacts of climate change. We need to do that faithfully, prioritizing our love of God and the stewardship of creation that God has called us to. And this has to happen globally, but it also has to happen in the church. So learn and act. And discipleship is learnership. This means we are all learners, and we must learn at every level what is needed to put what we learn into action and serve God as stewards of God's creation. I'm a learner too. We're all learners. I'm counting on all my neighbors, all my friends, all my beloved family to help me learn so that we can do this together. So how? As with most strategy, we want to think of people and resources. So when it comes to people, we need expertise, we need lived experience, and we need stakeholders. So here's some language from the resolution. I'm going to use green font to make it a little more exciting. Be it resolved that a climate budget committee will be formed to steward these resources and report on their impact. This committee will be appointed by the youth and young adult delegates of the annual conference. Remember, we're talking about stakeholders. Who are the stakeholders? In consultation with the bishop, no later than July 31st, 2023. So we got to move on this, and that's the suggestion here. So who's going to be on this committee? The bishop, at least one active clergy person already engaged in climate justice, at least one retired clergy person already engaged in climate justice, and at least 3 lay people already engaged in climate justice. There are fabulous people who are working on this, who have their 10,000 hours, and we need to hit their activate button. And we need at least 2 people underneath the age of 25, because they're going to be inheriting the climate according to our action or inaction, and at least 2 BIPOC members, because BIPOC communities are the most infected, and they deal with environmental racism and all sorts of other sort of structural roadblocks. And so their voices need to be heard. So the Climate Budget Committee will be charged with education, outreach, reviewing grant proposals, and making grants. And it will report its expenditures and impact to the annual conference body annually. And the annual conference staff will be charged with supporting this committee's work with at least 20% of their time. And the committee is empowered to hire additional staff as necessary. So this 20% numbers, as it will come back to that. So we've got people and resources, right? So now resources, what do we have? What do we need? And what must we develop? And then I made this little rhyme just to make it seem fancy, which is equip. This is discipleship. So again, wording from the resolution, be it further resolved that the annual conference shall commit 20% or more of its annual budget to support the net zero commitments of churches, camps, and agencies. And this climate budget shall fund resilience, prevention, preparedness, and essential emissions reductions. So now there's going to be a minor freak out of, oh my gosh, we can't lay people off. We can't put 20% of our budget towards this. I want us to think again about this, right? If we're all on a ship together, we're going to be moving that ship together, right? We're going to be reorganizing, restructuring. We're not going to be jettisoning people off the ship. We can do this together. So 20% of staff time dedicated to creation, restoration, preparedness, mitigation, and resilience. It's not layoff. It's just restructuring our focus. 20% of time materials in Christian education for Sunday schools, small groups. We can totally do that. We can hire a grant writer. So we can actually discover that if we look at restructuring funding and grants, we're going to bring in that extra 20%. It's not going to come off of anything. So 20% is easy. In fact, we need to get to 100%. So let's get started. So gathering the stakeholders to put the right people in place. So we need to act, not think of it as extra. This isn't for after worship. This is worship. If we are to get there, it has to be a shared journey of many voices. This resolution asserts that there must be funding, real, adequate, and committed funding to meet the strategic demands and strategic necessity of the work. So here we are back to our pantry, to our beautiful earth, and back to our journey to preserve the abundant promises of God for the generations of Abraham. We can totally do this. We got this. We absolutely do. So thank you so much. Let me stop sharing. And that is, I know it's a little scarier. It's a scarier resolution. There's some kind of declarative things in there. So this is about just talking about what could it really take from looking at that resolution. I'm hoping you're going to say, gosh, yeah, we can't just make commitments without funding those commitments, because funding people and resources is how we actually make that journey. It's how we actually get from the idea to making it in action. So that's my 2 cents and my 20% all at once. And so I'm going to now shift us once again to Bob and Nancy. We're going to kind of focus on the next question, which is, okay, so we have this resolution, and we want to maybe talk to our colleagues, our church family about it. What do we do next? So Bob and Nancy, I think, Bob, you were going to get us started on that. I'll turn it over your way.
Yeah. And obviously how you do this is going to depend a little bit on your annual conference. And what we did in West Ohio, and what I think is going to be kind of the general approach, is first of all, contact your conference secretary. This isn't a lady that takes notes for the bishop. This is a formal position in the staff. They're usually the ones that are responsible for setting dates and receiving resolutions and what have you. And that's what I did. I started by contacting the conference secretary. She responded with some good information, and not the least of which was the deadline, which will change and vary from conference to conference. Many of them are already passed, but there are others that are still waiting through April 1, possibly even into the end of April. But find that out, because it'll help you know what you're aiming for and when you have to go forward. They can also help you in details on what they're looking for, how you can submit it, if it has to be on paper, if it has to be through email, if it has to, different things like that. Once you do that, you want to then figure out what organization is going to submit it. It's probably best to do it with an organization that has the broadest conference appeal and structure. At the very least, you want to make sure that whatever organization puts it forward is in fact authorized to do so. As I said, it's a pretty broad grouping. An individual, you can decide to put it forward. One of the things you can also do is you get endorsements. And that, again, broadens the appeal of the resolution and shows that there is more support for it. Ideally, the endorsement is obtained before you submit it, so that name can go on the bottom of the resolution. You can have a whole list of organizations, individuals, churches that support the resolution. However, at least in our conference, and I suspect in most of them, there's also the possibility of getting additional endorsements from the time it's submitted to the time it appears on the conference floor, if it appears on the conference floor. And you can either sometimes get that list appended when you get to conference, or many times what you do is you can introduce it as you're introducing the resolution and give people from the conference an idea of the additional folks that are going to be involved. One of the things you want to do, obviously, is once you get to annual conferences, have opportunities to talk about the resolution, let people know about it, let people know what's coming. If you can send stuff out ahead of time, that's even better, through conference newsletters, through emailings, if you have a list of people that you can interact with. Those are all helpful ways of doing it. It depends a lot on your individual conference, what works best. At the minimum, I would recommend that you talk to your United Women in Faith, because they have excellent communications and generally are ahead of us in supporting these kinds of things. If they haven't already put the resolution forward for you, they will be a great ally, and that is what we're doing, certainly in West Ohio. So the other thing I think that it's important to get across to people, and Rashinda kind of talked about this with her funding resolution, but there's going to be a tendency for people to say, oh, we can't afford doing all this at once, or it's going to be such a huge amount of money. What you really have to point out is, actually, there have been a number of studies done that overall, the cost of shifting to a sustainable environment doesn't cost, in fact, may cost less than doing what we're currently doing. What people forget is we're spending money right now to maintain the infrastructure that we have. And so what you're really doing is planning ahead. If the conference is going to have to replace the bishop's air conditioning and heating system in 5 years, you plan to do it in a renewable way, rather than just putting back in what you had to begin with. The net cost difference may actually be less or more, just a slight bit, but it's not the entire cost of doing it, because you were going to have to replace the boiler and the air conditioning units to begin with. So that's one of the things that you need to keep in people's mind, is this isn't we're spending money here, but otherwise it wasn't going to cost us a thing. What you're really doing is shifting, in many cases, where you're putting the money. And that can help people understand that this cost is not as overwhelming as I think they will tend to think. Nancy, I'm going to let you talk about what you've encountered in Illinois.
Sure. And what you're talking there are some of the speeches that should be given on the floor of annual conference.
Mhm.
So one of the things that your annual conference secretary is going to ask you is, do you have someone to speak to this? And you've got to get those lined up ahead of time. And the other thing too is that you don't want this to go on the consent calendar. You want this to be talked about. And you want to have people that are very visible that they can talk to ahead of time. If you can get on the schedule for your pre-conference briefings, that might be helpful. But very importantly, to get a table at your mission fair or whatever they do at annual conference, if they have tables that are around, at a table, a place where somebody can go for some coaching, because people have questions. And out on that table, put something really, put your buttons, put stickers out there that they can put on their water bottles or their laptops, whatever. Get something that they can take away free that's not food. So just get it out there. Have a bamboo plant, think of everything that you can think of that says that you're trying to help the environment, and then do coaching. But you got to get word out there. You got to have people on board. The bishop has to know who to call on, so he or she does want to know who you have to speak to the resolution. And because remember, we're trying to form a movement, a national movement, so that we as a nation can get to net zero 2050.
I want to just jump in as well and say that there's a lot of ways that these resolutions could be useful in the conversation around net zero and climate justice. And some folks have a conference deadline that's already passed. Some folks have a conference deadline that's coming like a steam train down the track. And you might say, oh my gosh, I'm not sure if I can get it launched. Some of our conferences are dealing with the heartbreak of dissolution this year. And it's really going to be hard for them to find the bandwidth, even if this is something they really want to talk about. So we do not have to lose a year, because part of what we can do is teach. These resolutions can be part of the conversation you have. You can talk to the bishop. You can talk to other folks who are like-minded. You can have pamphlets at your booth to share about these. You could ask the bishop to have time for a speaker during annual conference to address the climate justice conversation, even if you're not going to be bringing resolutions to the floor. So these are teaching conversation documents as well as resolutions that can be modified. Since Liz is with us and she's so knowledgeable, the United Women of Faith have been so much a part of this process of the model resolutions, and we've heard a lot together. I want to just give Liz a chance to respond. If there was anything that we've talked about so far that she might like to respond to. So Liz, I know I didn't warn you ahead of time that I might do this, but I really want to give you that opportunity.
Thank you. I'm not sure if I'm an expert. I'm a fellow learner and a fellow worker in this call to seek justice in our community. So appreciate the work that's going on in Northern Illinois. Like, what a great model that you were partnering with local grassroots organization on the ground. So it's not saying the church is going to do something in silo, but it's in sync with many other organizations, grassroots and other, with the seminary, et cetera, and having teach-ins essentially, and then getting a community organizer to do trainings, and then planning a process, right, over the next several months. Okay, we're committed, we're 20 something of us, we're getting shot down, and when we come together, right, the support, the community building, and the nourishment and the activation. So that's, I just really want to affirm that. And I know that Bob in West Ohio and others have been doing that as well. And I think that is so key that we do not do this in silo. One is obviously within the church, but also there are organizations doing that work that we should tap into for resources and we can call upon. And I wanted to highlight in terms of the equity and justice. I know I didn't speak about it as much. I was giving a broader overview. Parts of the reason why we want to ensure that there's equity and justice is that emissions reductions, right, it can happen, but it can continue in exacerbating or creating new sacrifice communities. Unfortunately, our energy economy and system is very oppressive and problematic. And as Rachinda noted, that it is disproportionately impacting Black communities, Indigenous communities, Latino, Asian American, low wealth communities in the United States and around the world. And we wanted to ensure that the equity considerations are incorporated. And I just want to note, like, for example, when we're talking about renewable energy, a lot of the minerals that are needed are extracted from communities where copper mine, et cetera, or lithium is being taken from indigenous sacred ground as well. And so there's advocacy there. We need a circular economy as well. So there's a lot of things to consider as we're doing that. And if we're talking about just transition, energy prices, we don't want it to soar up so that there's energy injustice and people don't have access, right? So again, those are some of the reasons why the considerations are so important. And I would say, think about some of the ethnic caucuses and groups within one's annual conference. So if it's the equivalent of the BMCR, right? Or some of the plans that might be present to lift up some of these resolutions, because they may be, they'll see the connection point on their end as well. So again, it is seen as not just a siloed entity. But I really appreciate all the resolutions, the work that has been going on. And as was noted earlier, reach out to your United Women in Faith. Climate justice is one of our 2 issue priorities. And we have a campaign on just energy for all. So this is directly connected. And obviously at the interagency level, we're looking at things at the agency component. And so, but there are things that are parallel, right? And Bob and Nancy were both noting, in terms of some of these commitments, it doesn't have to be so explicit immediately, like all the details. And I think getting people on the floor ready to say, we don't need to know all the answers immediately. We could commit, we could learn together. And there are free resources available to learn about greenhouse gas emissions inventory, et cetera. And so other entities are doing it as well. And I think, especially with this network at the national level, in a similar way, the agencies have been meeting. I think when there's a critical mass of agencies, it can be, annual conferences that have made these commitments, then it's working collaboratively together, right, about sharing best practices. So hopefully, in the next several years, there will be maybe a quarter of the annual conferences that have made these commitments, which make it easier. So praying that in the next year or 2, there'll be several that are pioneering this, and we'll have many more to hear from of their work as well. Hope that was helpful.
Oh, wonderful. Yes. So that energy, all those ideas, Liz, you've been sort of working at this intersection for a good while. And I know that we're all learners together, but it's great to be able to benefit from your experience here and what you've already kind of seen and the kinds of conversations you've already had. Nancy, I don't know, I might be wrong, but I had the sense that maybe you had something you wanted to share. So, I'm going to invite you to, unless you didn't, in which case you are now on the spot regardless. So go ahead, Nancy.
I think it's so important that we get people on board. And, sometimes I feel like that we have jumped ahead of where we need to be, and maybe even taking a step back and saying, do we have the right people at the table? What more do we need to do? And Liz, I'd love to invite you to come to Northern Illinois and share about how we make this equitable and just, because I think we've jumped ahead there. So thank you for that. And it just seems like so important to get people on board. We're trying to get a really good structure in the Northern Illinois Conference, which I think everybody is. We kind of moved away from the program council and, how do we, move things forward? And the pandemic slowed all that down. And I just see our shepherding team as an agency that could move it forward, because all those people are at the table. We have Asian Fellowship, BMCR, and all the other agencies are there. If we could figure out a way to get a conversation at that table, I think we might even be jumping ahead here, even in a better way. So I don't know if there's a question there, but just to continue to form those groups that are working on it together. And I don't want to disrespect my 25 that I've already put 3 months into this. So I struggle with saying, do we want a creation care committee with all those, people in place that already have leadership, and are trying to do good things, or do we, just go ahead with the 25 that we have? Do you have any advice at Liz? Which do we do? Do both? I don't know.
Yeah, and I wonder if others here, I feel like there's lots of incredible wisdom here and what works best in your particular conference. I think the both and approach is useful because there might be different goals that you may have. Because with that shepherding table, it might be a lot of education, right? One of the things that we did at the interagency table was we brought in Jackie Patterson, who used to be the Senior Director of NAACP's Environment and Climate Justice Program, and really talking to us about equity and justice. And she was really pushing, saying, is it just net zero, or are we talking about just zero, right? In terms of even looking at it from a justice lens very deeply. And it brought in some people, when they hear net zero, all they think is, oh, right, as Bob said, the tree huggers are coming back again. And then, some, and from the Asian American context, we may think, there is a certain perception of like what people say are the tree huggers. And even though I grew up in Korea, actually, which is 70% mountainous, and hiking is my favorite thing, and it's a cultural thing, that's not the national association, right? And so I think being able to have presentations that relate to the BMCR or the Asian or the Native American Plan, et cetera, and build that as well as working with the 25. So I think it can go in tandem, and there might be different goals, but certainly not a competition, right? Because I think it's saying like, well, because sometimes it could feel like turf battle, but it doesn't have to be that way, right? We're all wanting to address it. There's different roles that we can play, and allowing for more of that space, and hopefully making those connections possible. That some of the 25 would be people who would be able to be in conversation with those on the shepherding team, right? That they could be a mutual resource and learn together.
I think that one thing is we have sort of framed this discussion around the U.S. context. And, as we talk about the voices of people who may have I'm an immigrant to this country, the people who may have immigrated and that may bring perspectives or may have generational perspectives that are different for wherever, unless you're a Native American person, somebody came here and you carry with you that sort of ancestral history of family. Globally, we have globally, folks have a better idea about how climate change is destructive. Our country, not only do we use up all our allotted resources by March 13th, but then we start to take other people's resources because we're still eating out of the pantry. And we don't necessarily have an awareness that we're doing this. And I think that one of the real opportunities for the United Methodist Church in being a global church is to really leverage these conversations. My sister, who lives in Uganda, is going to have a very different experience tomorrow, of what climate change means in her life than I'm necessarily going to. And those conversations are so important. So I'm thinking too, my son and his wife did a little traveling recently. They went to Miami, and it was wall-to-wall cars. It was cars, freeways. And then they went to Buenos Aires, and it was just like kind of two highways. It was still a big city. People got around on buses and on foot. And there was a whole different way of understanding how people could move within a city. I think for many of us in the U.S., highways is what we know. We've never been to Buenos Aires. And so that kind of conversation, those kinds of conversations, I think are going to help us a lot. Encourage us, give us some vision. Let us dream about our net zero community. Like, how exciting is that? Like, this is a good thing. It's marvelous. And we're going to be doing this together. So, what could be better? All right. So, Bob and Kathy. Oh, Nancy, go ahead.
I just want to, piggyback off of that. that dream thought. It's that you mentioned before that, excuse me, dissolution or disaffiliations might dominate. And I know some of our bishops in the nation aren't letting, this kind of conversation. They aren't letting this conversation happen. My bishop is, but because I am a part of helping the churches disaffiliate, I'm a trustee. And so as we help them disaffiliate, it's a real downer. And this is going to be so depressing. They need something of hope. They need to see that we're excited about what comes next and that they could be included in this small group that's getting started. So I just wanted to put out there that hope is so needed at this time.
Amen. We got the bright sun in front of us, the God pulling us towards this gospel, wonderful revealing moment of, oh, we're in a pickle. What are we going to do next? And really choosing some really wonderful ways to move forward. So, so Bob and Kathy, we have a couple more minutes for our discussion. Would you like to jump in with anything before we move to our closing?
Yeah, and I'll just add, as I mentioned, this is being recorded, but there was the session that was on Monday that's already available on our YouTube channel. And next week, there's another session on some of the other finance and divestment related resolutions. And all of those will be shared in the April newsletter. Another cool development that will be offered up is one of our Earthkeeper, one of the members of the annual conference team, Reverend Mark Brecken, took some of these resolutions and turned them into brochures. So if yours is one of those conferences where you're not quite ready to put forward a resolution, you can put forward the ideas, and those are already kind of ready-made in a format that could be easily shared. So there's just some examples of how the network, how this movement's network is kind of sharing good ideas. Those are the main things. And as Bob mentioned, just please reach out if you've watched this and you have lots more questions. You can find us at umcreationjustice.org and let us know how we can help. And it looks like Pat has something to add as well. I'm glad. Thanks.
Yeah, go ahead, Pat.
I can't sit here and not say anything. Just a comment. It is so encouraging to hear all you people talk. I've just loved listening to you very clearly. I'm thinking 10 years ago, somebody would have just at the spur of the moment, just thrown in some net zero resolution to the annual conference. And clearly you guys are brilliant. You have thought long and hard and deeply and very intelligently across the spectrum of all the considerations. Oh, it just gives me hope. And I just love to listen to you. So thank you so much.
Well, we're glad you're here too, Pat. So glad for your leadership and your guidance and all the work you've done in the direction of climate justice and all that we've learned. Oh, wow. So let me pose this right before we go. Let's say, maybe ask each of you, what next thing can I do? Let's say I'm listening in and I'm getting brave and I'm starting to hope. What next thing could I do? Is it talking to, is it finding my UWF leader, connecting with my conference lay leader? What can I do next to start that next step? And I don't know if we just want to popcorn that real quick.
I think for me, in North Carolina, I'm hoping that our team can have a meeting with the bishop. And we've got a brand new bishop, and she seems to bring some hope with her. So we're hoping that we can have a fruitful conversation with her. So that's the next step for me, I think.
Okay, so bring a team to the bishop. That's awesome. How about, I see Bob's got his mute unmuted. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, one of the things, we've done two things. We've gone outward and we're doing some work with our brother in East Ohio, which is the other conference that we share in this state. And that's good because we're getting some feedback and some enthusiasm and building on some common things that we can do. The other thing is we as a task force have been kind of a subgroup that hasn't had a lot of interaction with our Just Ministry Team or Church and Society. They keep changing the name, but basically today we had a conversation and they are interested in moving forward. And I find that exciting. But brother, anybody, reach out and find out where the interest is in your conference, because it may not be exactly where you expect it.
Awesome, Bob. Thank you. How about you, Kathy? What would you throw out there as a next step?
Well, our Minnesota Hopeful Earth Keepers team, which is the name of our group here in Minnesota, is meeting on Monday. So I know we'll be talking about our annual conference, and so we'll be talking about strategies for how we integrate and share these ideas and pick something to take action on.
Strategic thinking. I love that. I love that especially. I'm such a brat about strategic thinking. I think it's so important. Go ahead, Nancy.
Well, I think knowing your story, getting your story out there, knowing why you want to save the planet. And really, that's kind of what my Net Zero team is trying to do, is to get the stories, and so we're focusing on getting the word out that we want the stories, and we have a form that they can fill out online and tell us their stories. And then we're just going to keep telling the stories over and over and over again.
That's marvelous. I love that. Tell our stories. Liz, do you want to jump in with what's a next step?
So for me personally, I'm going to reach out to my church and also my DS to share the resolutions. So that's very personal, but I think something that all of us can do is actually share the link and the potential, resolutions with using Jesus is number 12, 12 other people, via email, and they could be a variety of folks, right? Not just in one, and then see how many of them, and say like, I would love, I was just part of this call, I want to share this. This is why it's important. So talking about Nancy's story and say, I would love to talk with you if you're interested, right, about this more and how we can make that a reality in our annual conference, and see, out of the 12, maybe there'll be 2 or 3 who are interested, but at least you've brought it up. So I think, as organizers, if we're part of being disciples of Christ, we got to expand and get this word out. So I would say share it with 12 others and invite them to more conversations to do this together.
I love it. And share with others and invite conversations. That's how everything happens, I think. So that really kind of brings us around to our last things. I want to encourage anybody to put links in the chat that you might want to make sure get shared. I'm going to pray us out, but before I do, I want to just make sure that everybody feels like they really were able to share what they wanted to share. Kathy,
And I am actually prepared to pray us out unless you really want to.
I would love that. You're
You asked me in the chat, so I'm actually ready.
Sounds great.
Are you ready for it now? Or
Yeah,
any other final words before I do this? Okay. All right. Loving Creator God, our hearts are full. Our hearts are full with the harm we know is happening, and especially the urgency of this moment. Our minds are full of the ideas and stories we have heard tonight, with concepts of carbon budgets and church structures. Our minds are full, and our bodies are tired as we come to the end of this full day. The work in front of us is important and it's daunting, but it is also so important. So give us courage, give us clarity, fill us with love and with hope. Thank you for giving us each other. Thank you for calling us to this holy vocation, and let us be faithful to this call. Send us forth filled with your love and accompanied by your encouraging, transformative spirit. Amen.
Oh man, thank you, Kathy. Oh my gosh. Wonderful.